Right. So, welcome to yet another edition of my conversations with scholars and authors and filmmakers who are writing fascinating books or building memorable artworks. So, our special guest today is Dr. Xavier Aldana Rees. And hello, Dr. Rees, and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. I'll just formally introduce Dr. Xavier Aldana Rees, who is Reader English Literature and Film at Manchester Metropolitan University, UK, and co-president of the International Gothic Association. His publications on the Gothic and horror include the books Contemporary Body Horror, which is also the subject of our discussion today, Gothic Cinema from Routledge, and Horror Film and Effect from Routledge again, and Body Gothic from University of Wales Press. And it's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Dr. Rees, and thank you for agreeing to be a part of this for this interview or session, conversation. It was such a happy surprise. So in our discussion today on body horror, we will try to locate the essence of Dr. Rees's fascinating book, Contemporary Body Horror. If you haven't read it, please read it because it lays the foundation for this subgenre. And also, we'll try to trace the trajectory of this really booming subgenre, which is coming up everywhere. And of course, for the audience, we will take up your questions towards the end of the session. Should we begin, Dr. Rees?
Sure thing. I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure, and thank you so much for being so patient with my schedule. I really appreciate it.
No worries. And I love the fact that we can all assemble here. Okay, so my first question to you, Dr. Rees, is let us begin with the history and evolution of the genre of body horror. So where outside cinema could we locate the birth of body horror, and how has it developed over time and differentiated itself from traditional horror films?
Of course. It might help if I start with where the label comes from, because it's always been a label that we apply in retrospect to some degree. Although many of the films that were made in the late 1970s and early 1980s in particular have become the go-to texts for defining body horror, that they're not made necessarily in the 1980s with that name or are not marketed as such is something that retrospectively is applied to them. It's really relatively recently, films like The Substance, for example, or Together, that was released this year, that are being labeled and marketed as body horror because we now have a greater understanding of what that means as a subgenre. As a term, it emerges in 1983. That is the earliest example of the terminology I've been able to find. If anyone spots it anywhere else before 1983, please get in touch with me. But to my knowledge, the first person to refer to body horror was Philip Brophy in an article in 1983 for the Australian magazine Art and Text. And although that has become the defining go-to article for the topic, he actually only ever mentions the term once in the article. And it's not even necessarily primarily the objective of the article. It sort of begins as a way of labeling a specific type of, shall we say, visceral or corporeal type of horror that is emerging at that point in time for very good reasons. The development of special effects, for example, in the 1980s, and a significant one, a different attitude towards the body, a much more explicit type of cinema following, starting in the 60s and sort of culminating then. So this is when the label first gets applied. But to answer the second part of your question, I mean, really, it depends on how far back you're willing to go, insofar as the body has always been a significant subject of concern for humanity and artists. I mean, we could go as far back as ancient Greece, a play like Euripides' The Bacchae, for example, has elements of body horror in it. The Grand Guignol tradition in France, starting in the 19th century, but especially in the theatre of death of someone like André Delorde, has a lot of elements of body horror to it. The mad science tradition that arguably begins with Frankenstein also has lots of body horror elements to it. So I would say that as a preoccupation for artists, filmmakers, writers, it's been there for a very long time. It's just you know, in the 80s, it finds its expression in cinema in a much more explicit way. And once the label is created to refer to this type of visceral or corporeal horror, it begins to be used more. And then as time goes by, and especially directors now who grew up with those directors from the 80s and 70s, that's a language that they were born with, that they recognize. So I'm not surprised that that label has become more used now because that generation is responding in some way to what we now understand as, the groundbreaking golden era of body horror.
Right. So what are for you, what are the primary traits of body horror then? And how have you dealt with them in your book? So what I'm really interested in is your method of categorization of a certain subspecies of cinema, let's say.
I mean, let's begin by saying that any attempt at, picking together something as complex as a genre or a subgenre is bound to fail. So I'm sure I missed some stuff there, and I very deliberately kept out things like slashers, for example, or more visceral gore cinema, purely because I didn't necessarily have many interesting things to say that hadn't been said before. I mean, the slasher in particular has received a lot of attention, but when the label starts being used, when film books like about splatter begin to get written, all of those subgenres are kind of sort of bunched together. So slashers are being dealt with alongside David Cronenberg, for example, and other examples of what I consider body horror in the book. So to to the best of my abilities, I tried to sort of divide them into two big categories. One, which is loss of control. It strikes me that a lot of body horror is about the body not doing what you either want it to be or what you expected it to be. So a large part of that was dealing with disease and infection. There's definitely a subcategory of body horror that's all about the unruly body acting in ways that we don't expect or we don't understand, trying to read symptoms into the body. That was one substrand of the loss of control section. Another one was the objectification of the body, and that's where I did include some materials that might be considered more slashery or gory, if we like. I particularly centered on stories about the body being turned into an object or meatified, if you like, cannibalistic. Some cannibalistic narratives, for example. And then I also wrote about biotechnological erasure because it strikes me that technology, although it's given us huge powers of expansion, has also, to a degree, erased some aspects of the human, or at least transformed them. And a lot of those narratives about loss of control are loss of control to technology, or loss of a sense of the human lost to technology to a degree. So that was one half of the book. And the other half was the more transformative side. A lot of these narratives were quite dark and depressing and very much about biopower and, a loss of not just control, but a sense of helplessness about changing things. So I felt the need to also look at the more positive or more transformative side of body horror. So the second half of the book is more developed to transformation in general metamorphoses. And I look at three different strands that have been particularly significant in terms of the number of texts that they have produced. And although they haven't been created cohesively, there hasn't been like a feminist body horror movement as such. They do cohere into feminist body horror, queer body horror, especially trans, a lot of trans written, trans authored body horror, and then Black or African American body horror, although there's a bigger one. You could also include indigenous body horror, which is also a growing area that I had no space to consider. But sort of post Get Out narratives that looked at critical race theory from the point of view of embodiment. So all these three categories were looking at body horror not just as a place of loss of control and limitation, but as a place to transform the self, to become something else. So they allowed for more progressive readings.
Right, right. Absolutely. So, what is more, at least according to me, what is more threatening in body horror is that, let's say, in place of this, the supernatural other penetrating the body, which is more the conventional, traditional horror genre, it is often, technological forces or the violent impact of gender politics or biopolitical surveillance. Which is doing what it is doing to the body. So these films have an uncanny tendency of inducing repulsion. Instead of drawing the audience into its narrative and spectral fold, it tends to, at least that's what I think, it tends to push the viewers outside. So how do you think we react to this kind of contradiction as viewers? So perhaps what I'm asking is, how do we deal with these anatomical flexibilities, hybridities and sicknesses,
That's a very good question, and one that I might need a couple of minutes to unpack. I think that there are two elements there that I can see. One is biological repulsion. A lot of body horror is interested in things that naturally create a sense of distaste or dislike. And people like Matthias Klassen may well have looked into the evolutionary reasons for these. Why we normally humans tend to find a repulsion towards certain insects and even fear, like spiders, for example, why we tend to be biologically repulsed to anything that smells or looks like it could be rotted, because we are hardwired into realizing that that could be a source of contagion, for example. So body horror definitely plays with all of that, with repulsion as a biological primer, if you like, something that our bodies naturally react to. But of course, it's also interested in cultural repulsion as well. What, from a gendered perspective, people like Barbara Creed and Julia Kristeva have referred to as abjection. And I think that's even more interesting because for all that body horror taps into the physiological side of being a body, I think what interests me most is how we construct the repulsive other. Now, of course, that's not exclusive to body horror. The creation of monstrosity relies on a very similar notion, that which is cast out. Um, what you mentioned about attraction and repulsion is interesting because, yes, whilst we need the repulsive, or whilst we find the repulsive something to cast out, we also are attracted to it and we need it in order to define the normative and the healthy. So there's always this kind of push and pull with the repulsive, whereby we need to push it out and we need a set of parameters that determines who is in, who is out, who is tasteful, who is not distasteful. And body horror plays with that. A lot of its narratives are about people who suddenly find themselves changing, find themselves becoming other or different or repulsive. And much of what they try to engage with is the process of acceptance, of repulsion of the self, but also of trying to make do with those changes, to sort of like accept repulsion as a part of being, if you like. So that's something that I find fascinating. It strikes me that it's a rhetoric that we see in everyday life as well. I mean, certainly the way that refugees are written about here in the UK. I'm thinking of comparisons that have been drawn by some commentators online, right-wing or conservative commentators, as cockroaches or insects. It strikes me as part of the same rhetoric of casting out, of transforming the human into something repulsive in order to deliberately push it out. So again, body horror plays with that, and I think deconstructs it, which is what I find really, really fascinating. It gets us to think about those processes of repulsion.
Just taking the cue from you, do you think this kind of excessive representation of violence also has this kind of, I don't know, perverse tendency to immune us to the violence outside? For example, if I watch too much of that, I might not react to, let's say, the Palestinians being killed because I'm already so immune to watching the body being transformed. I'm not affected by a child undergoing, this kind of bodily metamorphosis because of the famine, let's say. So do you think there's a risk?
I understand where that narrative comes from. Personally, I think the opposite. I think that this type of cinema, certainly in my experience, although I may be inured to say the violence in the text, I might not be personally affected by whatever viscera or the transformations themselves, especially body horror that is being made now in the 2020s, is very, very aware of what it's doing. And I think, I mean, it's questionable whether body horror has ever been made just for the sake of creating a certain type of affect in viewers. Maybe the work of someone like Herschel Gordon Lewis, who was just deliberately trying to affect you and so on. But I mean, this is something that was leveled at David Cronenberg at one point. Was he just making disgusting visceral cinema with no content? And I think time has proven that that wasn't the case. So I'm much more likely to think that body horror gets us to think about those processes, and that if you are repulsed by something, that might push you to think about why that repulsion is there. I don't think that exposure to violent cinema. I mean, we're talking about violence specifically, and not all body horror cinema is violent. But let's just focus on that for a moment. I don't think that desensitizes. No. What it does is it makes you more aware of what you're watching, and it cues you in to those aspects. So yes, it is true that people who watch a lot of violent content might become desensitized to the impact that it's trying to have, but I don't think that means that they're desensitized to violence in general. I think they might just be desensitized to violence in cinema.
Right, right, absolutely. So, what is your opinion on the speciesist appeal of these mutated bodies? So of course, almost all of them end with either yeah, death or a return to some kind of assimilation. So, however, from the vantage point of extinction of humans on one hand, and speculation of continuation for some other kind of transformed, interrelated, non-human, overhuman creatures on the other, does body horror provide some alternatives? Do you think so?
Again, a really, really good question. Yes, I do think that it does provide some alternatives, and there are films like The Girl with All the Gifts that very specifically looks at sort of like human hybrids, of course, from a highly speculative, fantastic context. But a lot of it is, what survives of the human, and what kind of hybrids come out of body horror. But I think what body horror is particularly concerned with is this notion that life is perpetual change, life is constant evolution. So it is fascinated with bodies changing beyond our control, faster than they should. Evolution in body horror happens too fast, impossibly fast. David Cronenberg's Crimes of the Future, people are developing new organs to adapt to the new context in which the world is covered in rubbish and so on. But films like The Fly or The Thing, especially The Fly, they are all very much about how do we engage with, how do we deal with change at a fundamental basis. That's a film that for me captures the spirit of body horror, because although it does have the moment of fear towards the end when the character starts to slip too much into something other than human, what we see at the beginning of the film, when he starts to change, is an embrace of that difference of, oh, I've got this almost superpowers that make me different. Now I can crawl up a wall. Body horror, and this is where I think it's different from, say, fantasy or superhero films, that it always borders on this notion of, but you're never completely in charge. Or if you are, it comes at the end of the narrative once there's been a process of assimilation into some kind of other new being that has to learn to exist in the world. So yeah, I think that they're narratives that encourage us to think about change and encourage us to think about hybrids, sort of combinations of things and how they survive into the world of the future.
Right. And so now could you shed some light on the aspect that in body horror, unlike the more familiar horror genres, abject, that you were also referring to a while back, the abject other invading the body from outside, I feel the elements of terror affect, from within. Could you comment a little more on this also? Because everything I think comes from inside, and that's where the change also takes place.
It's a great way of putting it. Shivers, David Cronenberg's Shivers, first full feature to get mainstream releasing, was also called They Come From Within. So it's a lovely, perfect segue. Yes, I think on the one hand, I think that there's this sort of obsession with things that come from within us that we can't control, disease in particular, which I've mentioned. Lots of films like Contracted or Thanatomorphose or so many others are about things start changing inside of us and we don't understand it because we don't understand our biology. Are they symptoms of something? What's happening to us? So on the one hand, we've got that kind of biological sort of general lack of understanding of how our bodies work that transmutes into body horror. But body horror, as you say, also has that social cultural element to it. And I think when talking about its insidiousness, I think a lot of it is questioning exactly what of the way we think is truly ever actually ours. I mean, this is something that I tried to tap on into the book quite a lot, the ways in which what Michel Foucault refers to as biopower, doesn't just repress or oppress life, but in fact creates or generates identity. We're always looking. The way that we construct our sense of self is by models outside of the self, and those models are historically and socially contingent. So it strikes me that a lot of body horror is looking at that in the same way that we have no control over how the inside of our body works. Our bodies might grow tumors or cancers or whatever. I think body horror is also saying, you've no control really over who you are, or you have only up to an extent, because who you are as a person, your subjectivity is also always formed by that which surrounds you, which is historically and socially contextualized. So it strikes me that films like, I don't know, The Substance, for example, do that very well. That's not just a film about misogyny and a woman being subjected to external misogyny. It's also about that misogyny being internalized. It ends up constructing her sense of self. She does that to herself because of what everyone else around her is saying. So I think that's what I'm trying to get at here, that a lot of body horror is about how all of those external layers, medical, legal, educational, familial, come into not just repressing, but creating our sense of self, how we react to others in the world and how we see ourselves in the world.
Hmm, absolutely. So also I've noticed something that filmmakers of the body horror genre are increasingly taking up the subject of motherhood, trauma, and of course depression. And in fascinatingly metaphorical ways, they are using the grotesque body as a vehicle for a troubled mind. What do you feel about this anti-Cartesian turn of events?
It's a lovely way of putting it, anti-Cartesian. I think there's definitely a sense in which trauma, I feel, is now a lot more embodied than it ever was. I think we have an understanding that mind and body are not separate, that they are one thing, or that they work in tandem, if we like, that they're not separate things, and that trauma itself, a lot of body horror is about trauma. Has embodied like actual physical, physiological effects that you can't just compartmentalize the brain and the trauma it suffered, that you feel it in the body itself. There's been a huge rise of body horror and just horror in general that's absolutely concerned with trauma and grief and its impact. There's even been a new book out analyzing grief in contemporary body horror, but I'm thinking of, sorry, horror, but I'm thinking of films like Smile, Talk to Her, Black Swan, for example. All of those are about exteriorizing trauma, turning it into an embodied thing. Or this film that I love that you may be familiar with, Relic, which is all about, again, trying to find a body horror cognate for dementia. I mean, my grandmother's got dementia at the moment, and it's a very sad thing. Again, loss of control of the body. You realize just how visceral and messy a body is the moment someone starts losing control of it. And I think Relic captures that beautifully, that kind of like black stain in the middle of her chest that starts expanding until it kind of eats away at the whole person and leaves a husk. And then that wonderful, sorry, spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen it, but that brilliant moment at the end where she's put to rest by her loving family, and there's a realization that, there might be a genetic continuation to that disease in the family. So again, I think that captures all of those ideas, not just about embodied trauma for the daughters, but disease itself as something that we can't shift. That's both physical and mental. So I think in body horror, mind and body are one.
Hmm. Right. And how do you read this massive resurgence of the subject of cannibalism? I mean, that's in recent films like Fresh and What Do You Wish For and Raw and Girl Walks Home Alone at Night or the series Yellow Jacket. I mean, it's almost everywhere. And if we do not even consider the zombie films, which you have not particularly kept under the body horror subgenre, but it's everywhere.
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot written about um, neoliberal cannibalism, corporate cannibalism. I do think we live in an age that's particularly concerned and aware of the ways in which economic systems need fodder to work on. I'm thinking and self-regulation. I'm thinking of films like The Platform, which was available on Netflix, which again, a brilliant sort of body horror-ish metaphor for the way that society works. Here are the resources, and then we go from up to bottom until there is nothing, and then half of if for no one for those who haven't seen the film is a very basic idea. This platform with food descends down this shaft. The people who are on each level, there's something like 333 levels, avail themselves of whatever food is available, and then obviously as the platform keeps going down, there's less and less food until there's none, and then the people on certain levels have to essentially eat each other in order to survive, if they want to survive, or kill themselves. I mean, there is no more 21st century neoliberal film than that to me. So I think there's definitely that element that we're aware of that. And some of the films that you've mentioned, What You Wish For, do that by turning the human into a sort of luxury, into something that's exquisite, that traveling rich people will pay extra money to get, local produce, create, the exclusive that no one else can have. There's an element of that. Fresh also touches on that. But it's such a sort of rich motif. I think it can do very many things. It's definitely been used to talk about the objectification of women. Fresh, as to go back to that film, is very much about women exclusively being sold to older men, as produce. It's been used to talk about veganism, treating the human as an animal, or non-human animals as animals, all of us as animals, to kind of tell those stories. It strikes me that it is very much in tune with another thing that we're seeing in the 21st century, which is the proliferation of the death game. We've seen this in Squid Game and so many other shows where, again, for the exclusive pleasure of the elite, the poorest will fight each other in a bid to at least give some entertainment, exclusive entertainment to those people. So I'd say those three things are the three that stick out for me. Sort of the objectification of people, especially for feminist purposes, veganism, and then the human as exclusive delicatessen, or even game for the rich.
But it's also interesting, don't you think so, that that it that the consumable, or what is to be consumed has shifted from the exotic meat to, but the human here is not exotic. But I also want you to think about, or tell me if I'm wrong. It's not exotic. It's, I don't know if they're challenging, the contours of the body, or what can be consumed itself. It's not hunger. It's not an exotic meat. Well, how do you think it is? I mean, what do you think it is?
I think it's the idea of luxury. I think it's the idea of the thing. I think they say this in Fresh. I want the one thing that no one else can have. It's that I mean it exotic in that sense, not as in, something foreign, or it's the idea of, I have the most money. I get to have the one thing that no one else can have. And what is that? The ultimate transgression, the consumption of another human being. We're supposed to treat each other with respect and have equality. I get to call the shots. I get to eat you quite directly. So that's my way of reading it. But as I say, it's a complex motif, and it's been there for a long time. I mean, Hannibal Lecter and so on. There's various ways of looking at it, but that strikes me as a particularly contemporary one. The idea of the human as luxury, shall we say, exclusivity to the wealthy.
Right, right. So I also feel that body horror as a genre also expands and deepens the figure of the monstrous feminine that, of course, Barbara Creed so beautifully writes about in her book. So, however, rather than enjoying the helpless abjection and possession the women. However, rather than women are not really enjoying this kind of abjection. We are more in the zones of emancipation and agency that also you pointed out that these filmmakers are very conscious. So do you think we finally have a much more effective instrument to deal with gender violence and LGBTQIA plus identities?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, it's a big issue to tackle, and cinema can only be a small part of that. But what I can definitely say, without a doubt, is that yes, the kind of old abjection model is, if not being thrown out, then certainly rethought. And I think one of the reasons for that is who is making these films. Many of them, I'm thinking of, Raw, for example, or Good Manners, which is a werewolf film in the kind of ginger snaps tradition, but it's all about love and understanding. Tiger Stripes, for example, they're all films made by women that tell very different stories about abjection. And although they still paint abjection as, shall we say, a source of repulsion, they also show that it is very much socially constructed. And you are right, many of them are stories of emancipation. I like to sort of look at the difference between these texts and some that come earlier, something like Ginger Snaps, which does engage in a lot of this, but has to kill off its monster. I feel that contemporary body horror is not just not killing off the monster, but centralizing that monster, making it the person who tells the story, and telling stories about acceptance, assimilation, the need for tolerance, the need for understanding what some people go through. You talked about depression when we're talking about grief and so on. Again, these are stories sometimes about grief as well, about learning to understand how other people feel to negative experiences, thinking of The Bone Woman, for example, in postnatal depression. Erin Harrington has written a fantastic book that I recommend to anyone called Gina Horror, which looks at the different phases of sexual, shall we say, the sexual cycle of women, starting with like puberty, moving on to motherhood, pregnancy, menstrual bodies, and then all the way to sort of the body of the hag. And she sort of explores all of those areas. And I think you can see in the way that that story is moving on. If you compare that book with, say, Barbara Creed's book on abjection, you can see how far we've traveled between those. Contemporary stories are much more interested in getting us to understand that abjection than it is in reinforcing the abjection.
Right. So on one hand, we have the untrustworthy metamorphosing human bodies, and on the other, a rising anxiety surrounding this subject object, self, other, authentic hybrid confusion. So how do these films then negotiate this kind of abstract post-human tension?
Oof, that's another very rich question. So if we understand the post-human by that which comes after the human, if you like, I mean, I read it in this book and everything I've written pretty much in relation to technology, although I realize that that's not the only way of theorizing the post-human. Then we all are already post-human to some degree. We live in a post-human context, not least because of digitality, but pacemakers, hearing aids, the body is expanded, extended, and fixed, if you like, through technology. And I think body horror has a lot to say about that. One of the key body horror films of the 80s is Tetsuo, the Iron Man. And that's a film about, I mean, I'm not sure that I know exactly what it is about. It's a very experimental, almost surrealist film, but it's very much about losing control, but physical flesh bodies melding with metallic bodies, becoming tanks and whatever. It strikes me that body horror is still very concerned with that. I'm thinking of films like Upgrade, for example, where again, sort of technology is seen as something that helps us engage with disability to make the body kind of enabled again, if you like. Films like Possessor or Antiviral, again, technology is used to take the body out of its remit, either jumping into somebody else's body or creating celebrity meat for people to eat. There you go, cannibalism again. So yeah, I think that what body horror allows us to do is to sort of like science fiction in general, project that into a future, project our contemporary concerns into a future where they are taken to the extreme. I've already mentioned it, but I found Crimes of the Future really fascinating, as I found The Shrouds as well, in terms of these are David Cronenberg films in terms of the futures that they portray. It's interesting that someone like him as well, who has come to define body horror, is so interested now in kind of like that futurity. What does it mean? What does it mean to die in a context in which we can continue to surveil the body? This is the context for The Shrouds. If you haven't seen it, the film is about this kind of like 3D CT scan technology shrouds that you can put on bodies of your dead relatives to see them decompose in real time, to sort of give you a sense of proximity or continued intimacy with your dead ones. And Crimes of the Future is very much about what happens to the body in a new environmental context, in which the body starts sort of generating for some people additional or weird organs. So yeah, I think all of those, the body of Cronenberg in particular, but also body horror, science fiction in particular, seems interested in asking those questions. What remains of us in a context in which the human is no longer, for lack of a better word, pure, but always imbricated with the technological? And a question that I didn't actually get the chance to respond to in this book, but that I'm writing about at the moment, is what the AI revolution means for all of this. Because the AI revolution very much captures the kind of sort of fear of the machine, the Westworld sort of type of imaginary, the machine coming to kill us. But many contemporary films, I'm thinking of things like I Am Mother, which is on Netflix, or The Beast, have started to imagine a future without humans in which AI reigns. And the main question that seems to come out of those films is the same one: is what is the role of the human in this kind of digital technological context in which they're not needed? In The Beast, it's pretty much about what do we do with this specific person in a context in which human fallibility is no longer something we need. We have perfect machines. So I think body horror taps into that, not just about what technology does, how it expands or extends the body, but what happens to the human in a context in which our own creation, Frankenstein style, ends up being or replacing the human, which is all about, this is where the AI conversation is going, isn't it? It's about, will people lose jobs to AI? Are humans being made redundant to the human creation?
Right. And so, just my last question then. So, looking at these unhinged, splintered, nervous bodies that refuse to remain our own, how do we, let's say, here on, comprehend the established notions of embodiment, autonomy, and even corporeal structures and aesthetics? What happens to all these things?
This might sound a bit wild, but I think body horror, as we're currently developing it in the 2010s, 2020s, speaks to a very contemporary sense of the self, of the body as well, in that I think we increasingly see ourselves as fragmented. I think, with the fall of meta-narratives, one of those meta-narratives that falls is the idea that subjectivity, the human, is a cohesive whole that makes sense. I think that we now accept that being, the subjectivity, is an illusion of wholeness that we make together, as in order to survive, in order to gain a sense of agency over the world. And that also speaks to something that is quite contemporary, which is the understanding of the body and the self as in flow, as fluid, as something that does not stay the same. This is why I find body horror fascinating. I don't know if it's because I've always been ill all my life, but body horror just resonates with me. This idea that I never have, just now as I speak to you, I'm probably developing a cold. I can feel it. We never really develop a sense of stability in the self. We're constantly changing. Our characters, our ways of looking at the world are constantly changing and fluid. So again, to go back to the notion of subjectivity and specific pockets or communities looking into the affordances that body horror does. I think that's why it's resonated with women. I think that's why it's resonated with trans authors as well. I think it sort of allows us to think about the body, not just subjectivity, as something that's in constant flux, that it's not stable. And to end on a sad note, I think body horror also tells us a lot about a feeling of powerlessness. I mean, I've talked about AI. That's something that none of us individually can do very much about. It always feels like a big thing that is outside of us that we can only react to some degree. And I think it's also true for climate change. Again, these are big sort of Earth-like concerns that exceed the personal or the one person, if you like. So I think body horror also registers that sense of powerlessness, of loss of control, of something that is bigger than the self that we can't necessarily alter ourselves. The one thing we can alter is ourselves and our way of looking at the world, which is why in the book I ended up with this notion of the thinking otherwise, of sort of body horror helping us to see the world differently through the experience of the other, of someone becoming other. We too become othered in the process of seeing someone become other. And hopefully that makes us more aware of the potential for change.
Right, but just taking the cue from the part where you mention your own body, it's also this fascinating, isn't it? Our own body decaying or that we aging itself is a horrific thing. But I think what makes it bearable is that it happens over time. It takes years to happen. But do you think this trope is manufactured, somewhere or manipulated somewhere in body horror genre where it happens so fast? Time as a factor is somehow lifted, I think, and then suddenly your body, you think, oh my God, this is not my body. Do you think that they manipulate time somehow?
Yes, of course. I mean, some changes are that rapid. I mean, if someone suddenly develops tinnitus, for example, that can happen overnight and change your life entirely. Some illnesses, if you get diagnosed with cancer, your life is completely transformed. But yes, I think if anyone's ever experienced the horror of Facebook, when it gives you that 15 years ago picture and you realize how much younger you looked 15 years ago. Yes, change is a slow thing. I think body horror likes to accelerate it because one of the things that we humans dislike in general, well, we dislike change, but we also dislike quick change because it doesn't give us time to adapt. Again, I think it goes back to evolutionary reasons. If something happens too quick for us to be able to take it in, accept it, and find ways of coping with it, it's more stressful, it's more horrific. But interestingly, a lot of these body horrors do end with an element of acceptance, despite the sort of increased element of it. Of course, accelerating whatever it is makes it harder to find a solution. And horror is always, after all, about fear and dealing with fear. So.
Right, right. Fascinating. So now the session is open for questions. Anyone who wants to ask, switch on your mic and please go ahead. Yes, yes, Dr. Hajar, please, please.
Can you hear me, Asijit? All right. So right at the beginning, I should say, Javi, it's such a pleasure seeing you once again. Listening to you in person or digitally is always the same pleasure as ever. Now, what I have to say is I have one.
It's breaking. The voice is breaking. Now it's completely gone. Does someone else want to come in? And then maybe we go to Professor Hajra again. We have a question from Martin. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So he says, thank you for such a fascinating and passionate conversation. We'll come back to you, Professor Hajra. We'll come back to you after this, right? Yes. Yeah. So he asks, is there a flip side to the sense of contemporary powerlessness? Can we find positivity in plurality, palliating fragmented selves through cooperation, coexistence with others?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. This is the bit where I remember all the things I meant to say that I didn't say during the interview. I have a section in the book where I talk very specifically about this in relation to the film Sorry to Bother You, which strikes me as a fascinating I mean, it's not just the body horror. I want to be clear as well that many of the things I call body horror in that book are not just body horror. Body horror is an element of what they do. But that is precisely a film that suggests that. It's for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's a story of a man who starts working for a company who essentially, requires his soul in order to sort of not literally, but he has to sell his morality to the company in order to get promoted. He gets promoted. When he does, he enters a new part of the company where very actively, very directly, slavery is proposed as a solution to the problems of the company, and he has to sort of go along with it. As the film progresses, he becomes also a victim. He becomes this sort of horse human hybrid, the Equisapiens, which are as the company sees it, the sort of working force of the future, because they won't, they'll work like horses. They can't complain or presumably get together. And they attempt to plant him as a kind of like Messiah-like figure who can report back to the company in case a revolution starts. And the whole point of the third act of the story is this creates a sense of class consciousness in the main character, and instead of selling his soul to the corporation and accepting that he will no longer be the same, he unionizes, and by the end of the story, the film ends with the Equisapiens coming together as a body of workers, as a creed, if you like, fighting the CEO of the company. So yes, absolutely. A very long-winded way of answering the question. I do think that we can find positivity in plurality, and I do think that the only way to overcome the fragmented self is through cooperation and coexistence. And I think that's why I like body horror. I think that's the message in body horror. It's never about accepting repulsion as the end of the story, but trying to find a connection and a way of working together.
Yes, Professor Hajra, please.
Yes, I had one comment rather, and one question for Javi. The comment that I want to make harks back to your second or third question, where you asked whether too much of indulgence in repulsion that body horror, makes us do, whether that creates an immunity to horror. I was thinking, about what Noel Carroll.
We are fated never to hear you. I'm very sorry.
Professor Hajra, there is an interruption again.
Can you hear me?
Now it's clear. Yes.
All right. So what I was saying is that when you talked about whether the audience would be too immune to body horror, and how we talked about the push and paradoxes.
It's gone again.
It might be a good idea to just type it, perhaps.
Yes, perhaps.
Delighted to see you, though, even if we can't quite hear you.
Right. In the meantime, should we go to the next question? There is one waiting in the chat box. It's by Rohan. So he asks, why is there, I think Professor Hajra rejoined. Yes, Professor Hajra, you're there? Are you there? No. Okay. So he asked.
Yes, I have joined in through my mobile. Something seems to be wrong with my computer.
Right.
Yes, to go along with what I was saying, it reminded me of the paradoxes of horror that Noel Carroll talks about in his book, The Philosophy of Horror, where he talks about the natural horror versus the art horror. So he says that art horror is something like when we are horrified, disgusted and scared by things like zombies and monsters, versus the natural horror that happens to us when we see something like, say, an oil spill or the Holocaust. So I think, going by what Noel Carroll would say, I think the audience knows how to separate themselves from what they're seeing on screen, take lessons from it, and be at liberty to understand when to relate to it and when to stay at a distance like a spectator. So this was a comment that I wanted to make. And there's a question. Could I ask that question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. The question is to Havi that, I was thinking about the 2021 film, I think, The Manor. I don't know whether you watched it. So the manor shows this 70-year-old woman called Judith, who used to be a splendid ballet dancer, but now that age has caught up on her, she cannot dance anymore, and she longs to be. It's from a gerontological perspective, she's really horrified with the changes that are happening to her body, and on top of it, she also has Parkinson's. So what she does is she indulges in a kind of witchcraft, which would, give her the liberty of adding some subtracting some ages from her life. So would you categorize that as body horror?
I haven't seen it, I'm afraid, but I will after this for sure. It does sound like it definitely at least treads on similar waters, if it isn't. I think more largely it's hard to say what categorizes as body horror or doesn't, because, as you rightly point out, many of these concerns permeate so many narratives, those that are deliberately body horror and those that, just use the same concerns but tell the story differently. I think it's interesting that it is manifesting in both, because as you mentioned, the way that we experience repulsion in real life and in fiction is different. And for some people, engaging with repulsion on a fictional level is impossible. There are people who can't tolerate looking at blood, for example, even if it's fake,
Yes.
or can't look at decay, physical decay, and so on. So I think it's great that body horror is manifesting not just in the horror genre, but beyond it, because these are stories that are worth telling. And of course, there's no shortage of stories about dementia, for example, and Alzheimer's, and various other neuromotor diseases. But they tread on the same idea of like losing control of
Yes.
the self, of like. I mean, I see this in my own family right now. Not just that, but the impact that it has on those around you, the sort of sense of displacement. I think that I also find very interesting in body horror, for all that it's based on the body. A lot of it is about what it does to our sense of self. How it separates us from our physical selves. My grandfather always says the same thing. I look at myself in the mirror and I don't recognize the person I see. There's an element to that, isn't there, about aging and about stories that look specifically at the aging body. I find those stories a lot more interesting than those that simply vilify the old person. So I'm thinking of films like Pearl, for example, the X trilogy, where like the body of the old woman is the source of objection. I find that a lot more I don't know, backwards looking. I don't think that there's an element of body horror inquiry there, of wanting to sort of understand, if you like. What I'm trying to say is there are still fictions that do portray, old age as just a source of repulsion and nothing else. But it sounds like the film you mentioned looks at this idea more critically.
Yeah, it does. And it talks about the loss of control, the failure to recognize the old self in the body, the old recognized self in the body. That is what creates the horror out of this movie, The Manor.
The
So
manner.
thank
What
you,
did you
Harvey.
say the year was?
I think it's 2021.
Brilliant.
I'll send you the details later on. I'll message you the details.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for attending. It's great to see
Thank
you.
you, Harvey. Thank you.
Right. So we just quickly take Rohan's question as well. He asks, why is there a sudden rise of body horror novels and films about deadly or body-altering mushrooms or fungus? Is
Oh,
is it mostly post-pandemic anxiety, or is it a signal towards more possible eco-entanglements? It's a lovely question, I think. Yeah. No.
yeah, great question. I actually use that very line, the sort of body horror as engaging with the notion of entanglement in the book. Totally, I think so. I think that we have become, in the same way that we've become aware, those fictions about cannibalism, of like humans being subjected to what we subject on non-human animals. I think that a lot of these kind of fungal weird narratives, as they've also been called, are about not they used to be all about kind of like nature as other, revenge of nature kind of narratives. I think now they are about becoming, one with nature. Yeah, the notion of entanglement, of understanding ourselves as part of nature as opposed to separate from it. I do think that there's an element of climate change anxiety. They say, don't they, that fungi and cockroaches will be the only things to survive, into the long future. So maybe there's an element of that. There's a brilliant book called The Mushroom at the End of the World, which looks at some of these notions. I think it's also connected to notions of apocalyptic visions of the future. We used to imagine that apocalyptic future, 40, 50 years into the future. That is coming a lot closer now in the narratives that we look at. We are sort of placing that cataclysm 10, 15 years, 20 years in the future, which I think signals the fact that we are aware of our impact on the world. So yeah, there's an element of sort of Anthropocene fear here that I think is interesting. A few of those narratives also propose, again, this notion of the kind of third other, the hybrid of the human and the fungal sort of surviving as maybe another form of evolution. But it does work on the basis that we are able to become one with the rest of nature. So yeah, 100% about entanglement, I think.
Yes, so, great. So Rob asks, in terms of aesthetics or effects, where do you see the post-human sublime informing your theorizing or a reading of or on contemporary body horror, transhumanism, etc.?
I think I more or less answered this when I talked about the posthuman element, but very specifically in terms of the transhuman. This is not really something you hear about as often now. I feel like people like Stellark, for example, have not gone away, but the conversation has sort of moved on, maybe because we already live effectively transhuman transhuman present when it comes to our phones. I mean, just walking around anywhere in a big city in Europe, people live through. I went to an exhibition recently, and I found this really, really fascinating. An art exhibition. People were looking at the exhibition through their phones. Their experience of the art exhibition was mediated through their phones. This is, maybe people in their 20s. I don't think we're just talking about media here or technology as an extension. It is a direct mediator of reality and presence for this generation. Something I find interesting, a bit of a tangent, but I must talk about it, is the impact that digitality has on reality, because we tend to think that it's one way we use technology to perceive the world, but that technology changes our sense of self. I've been reading about people who are having elective surgery to make themselves look like AI generated versions of themselves. So people will go to to a cosmetic surgeon saying, I want to look like this filter of myself, and making themselves look like the filtered version of themselves. That strikes me as a transhuman present, if I've ever seen one. The technology dictates the shape of reality.
Right, fascinating. So I don't think, do we have any other questions? Someone can switch on their mic and ask. If not, we'll
Yeah,
just.
that's
y-
okay.
Yes, I can't hear.
Yeah, it's Orko here.
Yes, Orko. Yes,
Hi.
please.
Hi, that was a great talk. Wonderful. I just wanted to, maybe not exactly a question, but I recently watched Together last week, and I was wondering about the film, and you mentioned it, I think, initially in your conversation. So I was just wondering what kind of new spin on body horror a film like Together could generate. I mean, I was thinking about the comedy of it, the fact that it's a love story in a very weird way, and the way it sort of it touches on a lot of things without developing almost anything, which is a bit strange. Towards the end, I felt like there was a queer element there in the final scene. If we look at the way they merge, sorry about the spoiler if that is one. I was also thinking about how this takes body horror to a sort of almost a vision of love that has nothing to do with species reproduction and maybe even extinction on the cards. I'm just generally curious about what you would like to say about a film like that from your research. Thank you.
You're right. Thank you for the question. You're right. It's a very unique film. I mean, there are many things that I've noticed about it that I think are, worth mentioning. It's rare for a film that's, self-professed body horror to get this much attention, for one thing. The other kind of precedent in the 2020s is The Substance. I mean, I was writing, in case anyone wonders, I finished writing contemporary body horror before The Substance even really made a splash. So like I didn't quite realize at the time just how big body horror was going to become. For me, body horror was always this kind of rather niche, still niche, sort of like sub area of horror studies that I've always been obsessed with because I'm a bit weird. So to see body horror like get this kind of attention and potentially the more people encounter it as a term, the more people will be interested in finding out about its history. So again, The Substance was one of the few examples where a director actively talks about their work as body horror. And even though Black Swan was also nominated for an Oscar, I think The Substance is the only film to ever be nominated for an Oscar that called itself body horror, where the director called it body horror. So I think that's interesting, and Together definitely uses that strategy now. I don't know if it's because The Substance was popular, so now there's a wave. But what interests me about it is something you've pointed out. It's very generically hybrid. And I think we see this in a lot of contemporary body horror. Love Lies Bleeding. Try and summarize that film in one genre. I can't. It's a mixture of things. The Substance itself, what the hell is it as a genre? I don't know. So I think it taps onto that, which means it's sort of generically a bit slippery. But yeah, you've also pointed out a third really important thing there, which is comedy. I've not really talked about this, but much of the horror of body horror can be offset with comedy, especially distancing or irony, distancing humor or irony. This is not just the whole kind of like Grand Guignol, a bit of comedy between horrific plays cleanses the palate. It's much more in the tone that the film sort of. It's hard to watch The Substance all together and take them too seriously. I mean, they demand to be taken seriously, but they also demand that you take them seriously tongue in cheek. If you are laughing with the director as you watch it, and maybe being horrified at the same time. So I mean, that's always been an element of body horror. If we think about, I don't know, An American Werewolf in London has some of those elements as well already in the 80s, that kind of mix of comedy and horror. But it definitely strikes me that contemporary body horror is more self-aware and perhaps even more generically hybrid than that which came before. I genuinely have no idea what people will make of this film. I'm really interested to see how people respond to it. I certainly hope that, like The Substance, it generates interest in the subgenre and that more of it is made because, I love it as a subgenre. So anyway, thank you for the question. That allowed me
Thank
to
you.
talk about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. I don't think there are any other questions, so we'll just wrap it up. And thank you so much, Dr. Rees, and for your brilliant inputs and deepening the body of horror genre criticism. And I hope we'll have more sessions with you in the not so distant future. So thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for being so patient and cooperative.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you so much. Okay, end the session. Thank you.